Thank you very much, Pisra, for this very kind, generous, and warm introduction. Let me thank, first of all, Stanford University, the SESTA Center, and all you for being here today. And my first thank goes again to Bisera Penceva and Maria Shevalkina for the kind invitation to join this workshop, Global Approaches to Sacred Space, the Center for Spatial and Textual Analysis for hosting this presentation, and also Professor Elaine Sullivan for her response after my talk. I'm especially happy and honored to present my research project in this prestigious academic institution in front of such a distinguished group of colleagues and specialists. Before beginning, considering the variety of themes that were proposed across the Global Approaches to Sacred Space workshop, let me start with a brief introduction about the frame of this research project. The physical and mental dimension of the sacred in a medieval church was not simply defined by sacred architecture. It included spatial sensory experiences that manipulated the borders between stasis and mobility, inclusion and exclusion, visibility and invisibility. These experiences drew on the architectural alternation between fill and void, on the aesthetic of materials, images, colors, and light, and on the inclusion in and exclusion from the sites of the holy through barriers, screens, and curtains. At specific moments and with calculated ritual rhythm and gestures, music, chant, sound, and scent, the liturgical performance enhanced and activated the community the aesthetic and spiritual dimension of the sacred through embodiment and multisensorial experiences, thereby exposing the porosity of enclosed spaces and the permeability of shifting physical or mental borders. It is in this phenomenological context that monumental liturgical furnishings, screens, altars, ambos, pulpits, and pavements signified areas, created the scenario for the ritual practice, and contributed to the experience of the sacred in its broadest possibilities. Because of their architectural nature, monumental furnishings are spatial loci that generate holy areas and subspaces. Their activation during ritual performances fostered the transformative experience of the liturgy. In this sense, liturgical furnishings can be considered liminal devices, following the compelling notion applied by Joachim Young to chancel screen. An interpretation that can be further applied to other liturgical installations by drawing on Eric Palazzo and Herbert Kessler's studies of the sensory and mental experiences of medieval sacred spaces. In connection with this, monumental furnishings are considered mystagogic loci, as they are still defined in contemporary Catholic interpretation, with this meaning that altars, ambos, and candelabra are permanent liturgical places, expressing the mysteries of the faith. And they remain monuments of salvation beyond their ritual use and activation. The historic scenario of the medieval liturgy in European churches has gone mostly lost, due to transformations for changes in artistic tastes, liturgical reforms, natural disasters, wartime destruction, and last but not least, pervasive restorations. Over the centuries, medieval ecclesiastical interiors have been gradually reduced to unitary spaces, mostly, but not only, under the impetus of the ritual and symbolic needs instigated by the Catholic Church's major liturgical reforms, the Council of Trent, closed in 1563, and the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. During this long process, medieval liturgical installations were the most widely affected elements. Screens were destroyed or moved, while altars and ambos were gradually replaced by post-Tridentine altars and modern pulpits. Such reductions and dispersions were especially dramatic in the Italian peninsula, the geographic realm of this presentation, where medieval and early modern liturgical installations have largely disappeared. If not, they are mostly preserved outside their original context, in fragments, or in incoherent arrangements. The loss of liturgical installations, then, deprives us of one of the basic hermeneutical possibilities for understanding historic sacred spaces. It will suffice to recall here just some cognitive and perceptive aspects that are lost with the demolition of liturgical screens. The first aspect is the exclusivity of certain spaces, objects, and images. Here, for example, the tomb of King Robert of Anjou in the sanctuary of the Royal Church of Corpus Christi in Naples, as we can see today, and seen on the right beyond the tramezzo, so the liturgical partition, according to the reconstruction proposed by Caroline Bruselius and others. Screens also required a set of strategies to stimulate the faithful, visually excluded from the celebration that was occurring beyond the screen. Then, the Eucharistic celebration was theatrically reinforced through the calculated use of candles, incense, and bells, in addition to the special importance given to limit, control, and direct sight. Moreover, one could add the dramatic change in the reverberation of music and liturgical singing once the choir space lost one of its walls. That is usually the screen to the ecclesial auditorium. And I thank Professor William Mart for sharing with me his observation and experience with the performance of the Gregorian chant in medieval churches about this respect. In this sense, the project Icons of Sound, directed by Bisera Pencheva and Jonathan Ebel at Stanford University, which reconstructs historic sound spaces, would also have a great potential for applications in some buildings of the Italian peninsula, for which we are starting to have reliable, complex digital reconstructions of liturgical spaces. Under these premises, the study of medieval sacred space must first face the diachronic leap between the moment of the inquiry, this is the contemporary one, and the layered secular history of the monument under observation. That is why a preliminary retrospective investigation across centuries is needed to recover the essential outlines of the architectural setting and its decorations at different scales. The attempt to map the topography of spaces and objects on a synchronic level in the past must confront the added complexity of identifying temporal layers where to position the historic information derived from material and textual sources. These data are often available not in a clear stratigraphic sequence in which layers overlap. Historic space is indeed a palimpsest, a page where the text has been partially erased and rewritten for new needs. It is a site of layered writings with signs that must be decoded and interpreted. This epistemological process and its complexities are surely well known to scholars, not just medievalists, who research stratified historic spaces. They require multidisciplinary long-term research projects and ambitious collaborative endeavors across disciplines, methodologies, and technologies. Just to mention two major projects that are working on the Italian peninsula, I would mention the ERC-funded project Rome Transformed, directed by Professor Ian Haynes and dedicated to the Eastern Celio in Rome from the 1st to the 8th century. And Florence 4D, a digital art history project devoted to Renaissance Florence, directed by Professors Fabrizio Nevola and Donald Cooper at the Universities of Exeter and Cambridge, with the support of the Getty Foundation. The collaborative project I'm presenting today takes a different object-based approach to various spatial and geographical scales within southern Italy. The territory that from 1130 until the unification of Italy in the mid-19th century constituted the Kingdom of Sicily and later the Kingdom of Naples. This territory is extremely rich in heritage, in medieval heritage, especially Romanesque sacred architecture, and of liturgical furnishings datable to between the 11th and the 14th centuries. These monumental objects have mostly been treated in studies of sculpture, but there has long been little interest in their function and generally in research questions related more broadly to the sacred space in which they participated. After the pioneering work of Dorothy Glass, who first considered the iconography of liturgical furnishings in Campania in connection with Beneventan liturgy, first, Nina Chomilidze has proposed an integrated approach to the ritual and symbolic aspects of furnishings in sacred spaces of this region. In addition, Bisera Pencheva recently elaborated on the idea of clerics as an icon of sound during the chant from the Ambo in connection with the Exultate liturgy. Manuela Gianandrea, Ruggero Longo, and myself have been testing an integrated approach across archaeology, art history, architectural history, and digital technologies to the study of liturgical furnishings and spaces across Latium, Campania, and Sicily. In the past 3 years, the discovery of an unpublished liturgical manuscript dating to the late 12th century from Salerno's cathedral has revived an interdisciplinary analysis of this monument, its liturgy, and its liturgical furnishings, coordinated by Maddalena Vaccaro and Jonathan Brusa. All the aforementioned studies propose methodological models or approaches that can be fruitfully applied to other examples. What remains now is to create the basis for less fortunate case studies, which are the majority, where historic events have not favored the conservation of sources and materials. To the sometimes poor state of conservation of monuments and archives, especially in peripheral areas of the former Kingdom of Naples, one should add the lack of studies or liturgical sources when these are available. Meanwhile, some areas and monuments are still awaiting archaeological investigations, or they even lack updated architectural surveys. Medieval southern Italy was a vast and polycentric territory, hosting different cultures and religions, with areas of multicultural character and contact zones. This territory was made up of local but composite identities because of the different dominations established in the south. In addition, contact across territories and in general the broader Euro-Mediterranean scale added to the character of this area. Architectural solutions and the organization of liturgical spaces vary according to the rite, Greek or Latin, and function, monastic or secular, parish or cathedral, for example. The form, materials, and techniques used for liturgical furnishings in this territory allow homogeneous regional mappings. However, the boundaries between regions were porous, and circulation trajectories could be unexpectedly vast. For example, double-staired ambos, the Byzantine typology that was also very popular in Rome from all over the Middle Ages, were widespread in Campania, using an example in the middle, from the 9th until the 12th centuries, but they do not seem to have been used in other regions of the south. Characteristic of this type of Campania ambos was the decoration with the story of Jonah, which in the Italian panorama appears only here and on Abruzzi's pulpit that you see on top to the left, probably as an iconography linked to the Beneventan rite. But the material and techniques among these examples are very different. On Campania furnishings, the decoration was mostly in opus sectile, following first Byzantine patterns, then increasingly Islamicizing for the connection with Sicilian workshops. Abruzzi's pulpits instead extensively use painted local stones or stucco, or show mastic incrustation techniques, you see an example on the top left, which are also widespread in neighboring northern Apulia. It is precisely this evidence of circulation and contacts that makes extensive and comparative work on medieval sacred spaces in southern Italy a stimulating and challenging endeavor. The project Mapping Sacred Spaces, Forms, Functions, and Aesthetics in Medieval Southern Italy evolved from the shared research interest and then close collaborations between Ruggero Longo, IMT School for Advanced Studies in Lucca, Manuela Gianandrea of Sapienza University, and myself. The project has turned into a cooperation between Sapienza University and the Biblioteca Hertziana, Max Planck Institute for Art History, which hosts the project and supports it with photographic campaigns and the digital infrastructure of the database, supervised by Dr. Alessandro Adabo as digital scientist. Affiliated with the project are architect Jayo Zhang, who specializes in cultural heritage conservation, and 6 advanced researchers, all art historians specializing in the study of medieval sacred architecture and liturgical furnishings, who are conducting field research in different regions of southern Italy. First and foremost, this project is designed as a platform for sharing field research and discussing cross-cutting issues in sacred spaces in southern Italy. The difficulties are not minor, not only for the already mentioned transformation of church interiors, in which medieval furnishings, when preserved, are decontextualized or tampered with, but also due to the high number of liturgical furnishings that have been dismembered, reassembled, fragmented, dispersed, or distracted. This reality often confronts us with hybrid ensembles that must be ideally decomposed and then analyzed in their single elements. The fragment, therefore, is our minimal unit of research. The experience of the project has prompted consideration of the fragment in its multiple ontologies. First, it is necessary to consider the fragment not a negative value, that is, a non-unity, but a positive entity, according to Melanchthi's philosophical definition. In other words, if it were not by nature, if it were not by its nature incomplete, the fragment would not exist. Based on distinction in codicology and manuscript studies between the textual fragment and the fragmentary text, it is crucial for our epistemics and hermeneutics to distinguish between fragmentary furnishings and fragments of furnishings. The first case, that is the fragmentary furnishing, is the case that we are seeing. Some of the pieces derived from the two ambos of Benevento Cathedral, which are today known only from old photographs and drawings. In 1943, a bombing hit the church and caused the destruction of these ambos, reducing them to fragments. But since we clearly know their origin and the unity that they formed, we could speak here of fragmentary ambos and not a fragment of ambos. Otherwise, the second definition of fragment is that of an incomplete element of an unidentified whole. In this case, the fragment is the only clue to get there. It is what Carlo Ginzburg calls the circumstantial paradigm. And this is the core of our project. For example, the small arches preserved in the cloister of Amalfi Cathedral testify that at least one of the two medieval ambos, only recorded in modern sources and now disappeared, was supported by small arches. Likewise, their measurements confirm the standardized production of these furnishings, while the technical and iconographic characteristics of the mosaic document the activity of a workshop in Amalfi specializing in the production of liturgical furnishings that also worked in other centers of the region. Most of the materials under study in the Mapping Sacred Spaces project falls into the last ontological and semantic field considered. Fragments that were part of a whole, now lost, that may remain are recoverable. Excuse me. On the other hand, this emphasizes the testimonial nature of the fragment, which is not only interesting for the hypothesis of recomposition of a whole, but which, as isolated element, can offer better insights in its material, artistic, and aesthetic values. In such case, as in the one that I'm showing, the interpretation of the fragment is also based on the comparison with similar entities, in this case, ambos spandrels, whether erratic or embedded in monumental objects. Hence, the need emerged for a digital archive to serve as a database for research and to produce corpora of medieval liturgical furnishings in southern Italy. The digital archive of the project, which is currently under construction, works both as a database to catalog and systematize the information data coming from field research, and as an archive to collect documental and iconographical sources. This archive is conceived as a dynamic research tool with three main features. The first is to organize knowledge, the second to answer to research questions, and the third one to raise new questions. And I will briefly show how. The first step of the project accomplished by the research group during the pandemics in the stop of research of field research 2020-2021 has been the creation of a census of monuments and sites of preservation, including churches, museums, and storages, in order to map the buildings under investigation and the current presence of elements related to medieval liturgical furnishings from southern Italy on a world scale. Field work on site, done from the project group member, is directed towards the systematic collection and mapping of data to store in the database. The database is a research space-based GIS database connected to a map interface that in its fully development will allow to navigate from the macro scale, the geographical one, to the micro scale, that is, to the architectural fragments and even their decorative patterns. The database is designed to operate on three different scales corresponding to three hierarchical levels, each with its specific ontologies: monuments, objects, and components. The first level works as a container. The second and third level form the core of our database. That is medieval liturgical furnishings, so objects, and their components, as you see here. The first level thus pertains to the churches or other sites of preservation, in this case, the Cathedral Church of Amalfi. Medieval furnishings and their components are mapped in the space of the monument container. You see this on the left. The second level, which you see on the right, includes preserved medieval furnishings or modern arrangement made with medieval components. In this case, a neo-medieval altar made with fragments coming from late 12th century furnishings. Going to the lower level, again, components are mapped within the object. This modern altar includes several fragments of the liturgical furnishings date to circa 1200s, among which a marble slab veritably coming from one of the two ambos that you see on the right. This slab offers an example of the different kinds of analysis that we perform on the objects. These include archaeometrical investigations, such as UV light observations, petrographic analysis, colorimetric and multispectral analysis conducted by Dr. Ruggero Longo to identify the materials employed. Besides ancient marble, so reused marble, and glass tessere, the artificial limestone identified by Longo and Giarrusso under the name of Stracotto is the first on the list, is a marker to identify workshops across southern Italy and is also a useful marker for chronologies. This allows me to add that also a catalog of ornamental patterns and materials and techniques employed will be included in the database. But the objects and components, so the furnishings and their fragments that we collect and map, are mapped in the database in their current site of preservation and location. But the database's entry also includes information about the original provenance or the hypothetical original provenance, being it a location, like a site, a city, or a specific monument, and also plausible function, and also includes suggested relationships with other objects in order to map possible connections about provenance and connection of workshops, for example. So besides the result offered for the analysis of the single element, all these additional information are creating horizontal relationships among different artworks at site, opening the geography beyond a single case study. For example, in the case that I'm showing, the suggested relationships are related not only to specific aspects of iconography, but to technique. So in this case, the combination of mosaic and opus sectile. This kind of new networks that are emerging from site research are going to be combined with the well-established relationship queries, the more traditional for the art historical research. For example, those related to the presence of iconographic motifs, like the story of Jonah that I was showing before, or the presence of the same workshop or authors. All this together will give new results that we will allow to produce thematic maps. For example, showing the presence of iconographies, materials, and techniques across the medieval South. All in all, the Mapping Sacred Spaces database aims to combine interpretive complexity with quantitative methods. The database will produce the first census of liturgical furnishings in southern Italy between the 11th and the 14th century, and will be the basis for catalogs of monuments and fragments, materials, decorations, and ornaments. The modeling of the data semantics of the database according to these different scales and the research need of the project is proving to be a difficult and stimulating challenge. And it is currently being specifically studied by Dr. Alessandro Adamu as part of the broader development of the knowledge graph of the Biblioteca Herziana. The research methodology of the project also foresees digital mapping and modeling at different scales and dimensions. For example, the mapping of the spaces and areas occupied and created by the object themselves on a topographic level. You see here, for example, the liturgical furnishings and the opus sectile pavement preserved in the Cathedral of Caserta Vecchia. Or we map the single components within the object. Here you see the mapping of the different parts in the pulpit at Cava dei Tirreni, spanning from the 12th century medieval fragments to 19th and 20th century neo-medieval integrations. Or, as we have seen before, the mapping of patterns and materials according to specific queries. In addition to mapping practices, some members of the group are experimenting with 3D drawing and modeling of medieval liturgical furnishings within the architectural space that housed them. Here, for example, the diachronic evolution of the liturgical setting of the Cathedral of Salerno. Or the study of the double-staired ambo in Ravello Cathedral in its original setting. On the right, you see the model with the ambo on the south side of the nave, according to the correct liturgical orientation of the ambo in the Beneventan Roman Rite, before its movement to the opposite side of the nave in 1272. And here, the path involving the ambo during the liturgy of the Word, while the Exulta scroll on the right shows the lighting of the candle on Holy Saturday. The use of digital tools, technologies, and methodologies, such as photogrammetry and structure from motion and 3D models, has been undertaken starting from fieldwork experience, so with a bottom-up approach, and relying on the help of specialized collaborators. 3D drawing, modeling, and survey are felt necessary not only to fulfill the traditional needs and purposes of art history, such as representing and describing spaces, places, and objects, or recomposing and suggesting lost entities and details, but also to exploit the epistemics and heuristics of digital models as regressive and progressive vectors. For example, documentation 3D models have been employed to extract new data from the objects under examination, while research-based models have proven effective to test working hypotheses, including those of reconstruction. And I will show two examples in a few minutes. In the research practice, dynamic heuristic relationships have emerged between the data in the database and the digital modeling. So these two, let's say, complementary parts of our work. So the database and the digital modeling are not to be intended as a dichotomy between the tabular collection, the database, and the visual presentation, that is the model, the visual presentation of research data and results. I will clarify this statement with two case studies, starting from the first one, from data to model. The Church of the Benedictine Abbey and Cathedral, founded by the Norman King William II at Monreale near Palermo, consecrated in 1177, is mostly known for its wall mosaics. It appears today like an immense unitary space, but its liturgical apparatus at the time of consecration included an impressive, massive ambo and monumental double-wall choir screen 4 meters high, all made of rendered green porphyry, Cipollino marble, and gilded mosaics. This ensemble has completely disappeared, as it was dismantled in 1658, and its surviving parts were destroyed by a fire in 1811. What remains today are scattered fragments distributed across the church, the museum, and a storage. This fragmentary evidence is widely counterbalanced by a corpus of textual sources, along with some plans, dating from the late 15th to the 19th century. The few fragments preserved in the complex of Monreale are nonetheless highly significant for their material qualities and the possibilities to verify measurements handed down by the early modern sources. The work of interpretation, alignment, and cross-references of these different sources has allowed to develop a 3D model with an initial reconstructive hypothesis of the choir screen and ambo. An inventory made in 1658, the year the installations were dismantled, has been fundamental for modeling the single elements and for building the model, because this inventory records shape, former position, dimensions, materials, and decoration of each element. So in the end, it was possible to derive measurements of the entire ensemble from the model. This was the preliminary hypothesis. In the second phase, however, through the repeated cross-examination of the different sources in a tabular system, combined with the on-site study of the architecture and some reference in situ coming from the Opus Sectile payment, Ruggero Longo and I have finalized the work on the digital model, thus allowing to verify and correct the first hypothesis and come to a more reliable proposal. The next step, that is currently in preparation, is the transfer of the case study into an HBIM, an historical building information model, equipped with its paradata and metadata, so a real serious 3D model. For this purpose, we are initiating a collaboration with a team of specialists based in Germany, led by Professor Piotr Kunoczynski. Meanwhile, a new photographic campaign and further archive researchers are scheduled for the next month. This case study speaks for the hermeneutic potential offered by systematized and visualized tabular data in order to formulate hypotheses of 3D reconstruction of artifacts and their spatialization. I use the word reconstruction, which is also highly contested, with a generic meaning to refer to the hypothetical recovery of forms of the past that lack material traces and on which we have only incomplete evidence. Of course, for spatial contexts affected over the centuries by transformations that have been radical and irreversible, a scientific reconstruction has always to remain partial and always to be open to discussion and to be modified. We consider 3D models as a visualization of an hypothesis or an idea, a research tool that is not the final aim, a dynamic knowledge of sight, following the definition of Schreibman and Papadopoulos. The second case study that I'm presenting offers the example of a process exactly opposite. This time, it is not about the virtual reconstruction or virtual recomposition of fragments, but it's about the virtual deconstruction, so the virtual destruction, if you wish, of an existing and apparent unitary object. The research team for this case study was composed by Jae Zhang, Ruggero Longo, and myself. The objects in question are two 4-meter-high marble columns with inlaid marble that are today in the sanctuary of Amalfi Cathedral, where they are attested by old photographs from the early 19th century. Their resemblance to the Easter candelabra of southern Italy, so the column for the Easter ceremony, has puzzled scholars, since the candelabrum for the Easter candle was only one in medieval churches, and there are no other cases of two candelabra. The existence of these twin candlesticks or candelabra has therefore led to scholars to speculate that one of the two may have been located originally in the lower church, where the body of the Apostle Andrew is located. However, archival research did not prove this hypothesis. This time, it is mainly the analysis of the objects themselves, not the textual sources, that provided the primary source for research. Direct observation of the actual objects made it possible to identify medieval parts and to make the hypothesis of heavy restoration additions. The medieval portions include glass tiles and tesserae made from fragments of medieval Islamic pottery, as you see on the slide, and other materials that are used in the marble furnishings of the Amalfi Coast in the late 12th century. You see on the left a comparison with the fragments of other furnishings surely commissioned by the Bishop Dionysius around 1200s that share the same material characteristics. The portions with restorations instead present modern made glass tesserae and are entirely devoid of ceramic tiles. And this is totally inconsistent with the medieval decoration. The capitals and the plinths of the two columns are also clearly elements that do not belong to the medieval period. So the next step of the analytical process has been the isolation of the medieval portion. Only at this stage did it become clear that the two columns were presumably derived from the original Paschal candelabrum, which was cut in two symmetric portions and integrated with an in-style decoration. This time, rather than modeling lost objects starting from historical data, the process starting from modeling the existing objects to extract new data. This was made realizing a three-dimensional model of each column through the system of structure from motion. The digital replicas obtained through this methodology made it possible first to verify the research hypothesis better than what could have been done through the real objects. Indeed, the observation in the virtual environment has allowed to detect substantial differences in the execution of modern parts, especially of one of the two columns, to study the materials from close, and to detect the place of the conjunction between the original material and the new ones made in the late 19th century. The hypothesis of recomposition of the two parts was made testing the rotation of the two valves of the around the longitudinal axis. Once the correct orientation was identified according to the consistency of the 8 inlaid vegetal elements around the columns, this allowed to virtually reassemble and restore the original globe at the center of the medieval candelabrum. It has then been possible to move from the replicas of the columns to the modeling of the hypothetical original lost object, proposing a virtual anastylosis of the lost Amalfi-Pascal candelabrum. For the top of the column hosting the candle, for several reasons I cannot mention here, we propose a capital that is today hosted in the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. The navigability of the digital objects first allowed metric verification and observation aimed at mapping the restorations. Then, the virtual environment has made it possible to operate the virtual decomposition of the two columns into their elements, isolating the medieval portions. And finally, the digital environment has offered a primary heuristic tool to verify the working hypothesis. The three-dimensional digital model has allowed to start this time from real object to extract new data for the liturgical setting of the medieval cathedral in Amalfi and for our database. The Mapping Sacred Spaces projects aim to respond to a research desideratum about pre-modern southern Italy, thus contributing to the knowledge of sacred spaces in the medieval Mediterranean. The stable but dynamic and institutionally unconstrained research team, composed largely of early career scholars devoted to field research and archival research, guarantees the acquisition of new and reliable data. Our research methodology has developed in the field on the personal expertise of the project coordinators and on the group. Rather than being decided a priori, the methodology has so far followed the direction suggested by the materials and problems of the different case studies and is rapidly evolving. It is also for this reason that the project promotes workshops and publications devoted to issues related to historic sacred spaces and builds institutional collaborations to implement in particular aspects related to survey technologies and spatial digital humanities. The advancement of research on the territorial scale promoted by the project is progressively contributing to the enrichment of the picture of a fluid artistic geography and the redefinition of some chronologies and narratives long sedimented in art historical studies. Mapping fragments, objects, sacred spaces, and networks across different scales offers vast result and potential. In this sense, we claim the effectiveness of mapping as a fundamental approach to the spatial humanities and digital mapping as an opportunity to take advantage for. The next challenge will be to develop a deep mapping that will also encompass, for example, the multiplicity of places entangled in an object that has moved through time and space, like the Capitol today in Toronto, probably originated on the Amalfi Coast, then passed hand to hand in the antiquarian market of Florence, Milan, Paris, London, and finally acquired by the Royal Ontario Museum. It is true that we cannot forget the so-called lie of the map. Every map is the result of an arbitrary choice of what we decide to represent using select evidence and how we decide to represent it. A productive approach, in our opinion, is to consider each mapping as a dynamic, not static result, an open work that is constantly being updated. Mapping is an approach, a state of mind, more than a result materialized by a map. Thank you very much for your attention.
The audio. Okay, is this just, all right, it's going from here, great. Thank you. Well, thanks everyone for letting me sort of join in and put in my 2 cents after this really fascinating presentation. And I think this is such an inspired example of collaboration and how thinking about sharing data and digital information between many scholars allows us to do things that no individual could do. And this really provides a model that others could follow in other regions and other areas of study. So thinking about this really mapping a whole region at the level of the fragment and object could really only be done with these kinds of digital technologies. And I'm so glad to see that there's creative uses. So just a couple of thoughts and maybe jumping off points for discussion from what we've seen today. An article that I've always thought was really interesting, written by Pelio and Knight on mapping the senses, perceptual and social aspects of late antique liturgy in San Vitale, Ravenna. It's a 2013 published article on archaeoacoustics, the study of the church of San Vitale in the 6th century CE. And that examined both sight and sound within the church space and mapped the sensory aspects of various parts of the church. And they did this thinking through the identity of the community, of the clergy, as well as the gendered status as male and female members of the congregation, whose textual sources suggest were seated in separate parts of the church, while acknowledging, of course, that there may have been some areas or moments of movement or crossing of those spaces. But Pelio and Knight concluded that gendered spaces of that the church had gendered spaces, and those gendered spaces have different levels of visibility and different acoustic experiences. And those different spatial zones also controlled the interactions between male and female parishioners. So one thing that this talk really brought up to me is then using this kind of mapping and these liturgical architectural pieces and their presence or absence to think about questions of communities of use in these spaces and to think about questions of access, inclusion, or exclusion for specific groups and identities. And so that would be something that I'd love to hear more about. Another series of questions this brought up for me is the question of using 3D for investigating more than just one moment of time in a space, but multiple moments. In my own work in Egypt, I've focused on examining temporal change in sacred landscapes. And so I would love to hear our speaker talk more on how that we can, how that can be incorporated, that change over time in the building can be incorporated, and thinking about how these different moments and the changing of furnishings can be interpreted to think about the agency behind the manipulation of the sacred experience, or alternatively, the group experience and how that might have shifted or morphed at different moments because of those changing types of architecture. And then another thing that I would love to hear more about, and sort of to zoom out from those individual object questions, is to think about the larger landscape. Can we think about questions of both inside, which we've heard a lot about today, but then also outside? How does the exterior form and decoration work with those interior spaces? And could we place these buildings within even larger landscapes, thinking about approaches to these spaces, and how the larger landscape around these individual buildings would have played a role? So I'll leave you with those questions and let you respond.
Thank you very much for your comments and questions. I didn't take note, but I hope I will remember all of them. So related to the first question, gender spaces and the possibilities of like participating in sound liturgy, etc. As far as I could say, for the Italian landscape, this has been successfully investigated and studied for Central Italian churches, for Tuscan churches, for example. The work of Donald Cooper on this has really has really produced a lot of material exactly on this respect. As far as our case studies are concerned, I think that we need a bit of time to go to that point, because as I was saying, the first really big endeavor is that to try to reconstruct as much as possible or understand the spaces. In many cases, we do not have liturgical sources. We do not have we have historical sources, but that point really needs deserves further investigation. For what I can say, a good amount of data are available for the Cathedral of Salerno, which is really an interesting case study, and could really give, let's say, elements for many of your questions. First of all, because there we are able to work on different temporal layers, because the stratification of the furnishings itself is very clear, and it also gives information about the agency of the clergy in sacred space, because it is very evident that the different archbishops of the city, which were belonging to very powerful families in the kingdom, each of them was adding a new element or was manipulating those of the others before. So this was also a way to impress their own name and presence in a space by, on one hand, reinforcing the memory of the previous bishops, but on the other hand, of course, putting something new, embellishing them, enriching them, making them bigger, etc. One other thing that is very interesting also for Salerno Cathedral is that thanks to the richness of the liturgical sources, the last one being the manuscript that I was mentioning, of which I think a critical edition is in preparation by Maddalena Vaccaro and Jonathan Brusa, has also given information about the different communities of Salerno that were participating in the life of this church over the year. Nino Melissa has already analyzed the palm procession through the city, and now, for example, the community of Jews was included in some parts of the ceremony. They were participating in some part of the procession, and were also had strategic points in this ritual outside the church in the atrium, for example. So in that case, I think further investigation could be done in that direction. I think I missed the last question.
Just about the larger, I mean, the
landscape
question has to do with the landscape, right?
Yeah.
When we're thinking about these connections between, especially for things like ritual processions.
Yeah.
Moving from one space to the next, thinking about roadways, processional ways, and then also just the larger exterior as, because in your talk, you do talk about this idea of exterior and interior and who was included and excluded. And so thinking about also that the idea of the larger landscape and exterior of the space.
Yeah, so we are taking into account that as either in urban spaces, like, for example, one of the best known cases to me, because I studied it, is the case of Naples. I was more focusing on Norman Romanesque case studies here, but also included in the project is the 14th century, when, for example, the city of Naples was really characterized, or was really, how to say, was, let's say the Angevin dynasty was really impressing its presence through the construction of imposing church buildings that also had connections among them for ritual processions in the city. And the architecture in some cases is really creating also a connection between the interior and the exterior in order to foster this kind of let's say externalization of the liturgy and the sacred space also outside. There are some other cases very interesting of churches, maybe more, we would define them today, peripheral areas. They were not peripheral at all, of course, where natural landscape plays a major role, of course. And that is also part of the study of some of my colleagues who are working on this aspect specifically. So on the other hand, each case study should be, of course, considered in its own, but also that aspects are included in our analysis.
Yeah, it just makes me think, so in the Egyptian sort of viewpoint, there's different messaging in different sections of a, for example, temple space, where the kind of decoration on the exterior of, say, the outer pylons is a certain type of message that is designed for a certain type of viewer based on who has differential access to the space. And as you move further within the temple, the actual imagery and the space and the size and the furniture would have changed dramatically as you go through, right? So thinking about those kinds of differential levels of decoration and access as being very critically and thought out and planned.
Absolutely, I can confirm this also for the medieval architecture that we are considering. This is absolute. In some case, of course, we also have to deal with the loss of mural painting or movable objects, etc. But it is also very clear that spaces, on the one hand, created by the church makers, if we can say that, and spaces that were gradually occupied by other actors, really take into account this organization, accessibility, and publics, and that is why it also, in this sense, it is crucial to understand the internal organization of the space and the possibility, not only in the plan, but also on a three-dimensional scale, in order to, for example, realize that the huge Cathedral of Monreale was basically closed by a wall, an enormous wall of porphyry that made basically impossible for everyone to see other than the big Christ in the apsis. But this, of course, was a well-studied effect. The material chosen was not, of course, by chance, the porphyry. So this was really part of the aesthetics that the king, Royal II, wanted to have in his royal church, which was the biggest city in the the biggest church in the Mediterranean at the point after Hagia Sophia. So, of course, thank you very much for this comment.
We'll open this up for like 15 minutes, questions from the audience. We do have some folks online, and we'll encourage them to submit their questions textually, and then I'll try to bring them in.
Thank you so much, Dr. Scirocco. I have a question maybe for both you and Professor Sullivan. You so deftly move between the fragment as this kind of microcosm and then the macrocosm implications and then back again. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more in your projects with your team on the digital version of what you're presenting. What are you choosing to forefront if you are making a choice between this multiplicity of objects or these overarching questions, and whether you think that there's like an implication to how your projects present themselves in digital communities?
Thank you very much. That's a great question. And thinking about multi-scalar projects, especially when we're talking about the digital, because you are creating in the digital. And so the scale of your project and what people can interpret from it and what you as a scholar can interpret from your project is very much linked to that. So two of my projects that I've worked on have been extremely large scale, really at the level of landscape or building. And so, you know, I'm thinking about many buildings, large spaces, thinking about large scale views, people viewing from outside. And so the kinds of questions that you can then answer are around those kinds of issues. You can't answer really detailed questions about, you know, one person's emotional experience with color and light in space if you're not designing that space in a really careful, very small scale way, right? So, you know, I think that just like in a regular 2D map, the scale of the map absolutely influences the scale of your analysis of that space. So I think when we work in 3D, we also have to remember that it has those same kind of scale of issues as a 2D map does, with sort of level of detail. And one of the exciting things about 3D is that you can zoom across those levels of detail. So I can build a landscape model, and then I can also build, you know, one building that is extremely you know, well researched and well textured and with all of those details in that. And then you can consider those things at the same time. So I am working on another project now where I'm working with Rita Lugarelli at UC Berkeley, where we've modeled an object in the Hearst Museum at Berkeley, and we've translated the hieroglyphs, and we are going to put it back we're going to digitally recontextualize it in its tune in the Scirocco landscape. So that is the sort of level of multi-scalar where we're actually talking about one individual object within a larger framework, within the larger landscape. And sort of zooming in and out between those different levels of scale in order to think about an object within this larger space in which it sort of emerged out of.
Thank you very much for the question. I mean, my experience is far more limited than yours. In our case, we decided we had to decide to what to privilege, and we decided to represent the objects and monuments in their current state. So the first decision was about time. So we are representing the current situation. And for that, we decided to go from the macro scale, so the cartographic scale, to the fragment. And a digital mapping with a GIS allows you to zoom in and out. And this is the advantage of digital mapping compared to traditional, let's say, analogic mapping, if you wish. The real challenge that we're facing is to build the ontologies of the database in a way that the database can respond to these different scales in a coherent way. And this has revealed very, very difficult, complex, and we are still studying a solution for that. I've realized how complex is building a new database when you cannot rely on something that is always available for your research questions. So this is really one of the biggest challenges that we're facing. The other one is that we really feel the need to find a way to represent also time. And this will bring the mapping to another level. So we are now trying to understand whether the deep mapping can be a solution and how we can really go to that point if we are able to add another level of complexity. But this will probably require some more years.
Thank you very much for this wonderful talk and introduction of this conference project. I would like to ask you if you could share with us some of the insights that this work is bringing in terms of your own research. And I say this with any specific in mind. I've always stayed away from building of a large data projects because they're very complex in the way they navigate networks of people. So I worked on a much smaller scale for everything. But I would like to share with you guys seeing a time-lapse of how movement of diurnal light in space affects the partnership has been really eye-opening for me. For things that are obvious, but I didn't think about it. For instance, like how much light is focused on the spectrum to realize that most of the factors are shadow. So what was some of, have you had a chance in this to have some of these moments? One of them that you'd like to share with us. But to me, it's the joy of a humanist involved in digital kinetics. Which as it was worth all the effort. So I would like to hear it.
Thank you very much for your question, Bisera. So as I was like suggesting between the lines, none of us is a digital born humanist. So we were all arriving to this experience starting from research needs. In my case, I started to built 3D models of the Amboy Ravello, of the furnishings that I was studying, because I realized that expressing my hypothesis in text was not enough. The model forces you to come out. You cannot hide your proposal in the lines of a text. And on the other hand, by modeling, you really understand what you're suggesting, and you can really verify the hypothesis. You can correct them, and you can come back to look at sources and the material that were used for your research with other really tools and perspectives. So this for me was really the big discovery. On one hand, I feel very humble because I'm really experimenting step by step, and we have we are having the great opportunity of dialoguing with colleagues that are far more expert in these fields. We are discussing their projects, and we are starting to understand better how we can develop our own micro expertise, if you wish. Like I've learned how to do photogrammetries, even though we were asking for the help of the colleague Jayo Zhang for doing it. So I can say that working with the digital was really for me eye-opening, because it was not just the visualization of an idea, but it was also helping me in understanding better my research and coming to new results. And I think the most surprising thing for me was the study in the digital environment of the Amalfi candelabra, because there we really realized that the study from real, close to the object, was not enough, because we needed to go back and look at details that were maybe at 4 meters of height, and photographs were not enough. We had really the possibility of turning the objects, evaluating details, making hypotheses, and coming back to verify them. So this for me was really the moment in which I realized how important it is to really work with digital technologies in this field.
For instance, after the Tower, I think they have a virtual reality.
Yeah.
The space, there's like models to reorient to how the actual participants have navigated the space. So think about the relationship between, these models and all your data with the actual sites. And also how might people envision, this information again, and supplementing that experience like international city or neighbors and in the church, like, the comments. So like how when you see, this hasn't been known in the church, like how can you imagine or how can that space be presented in that snapshot of my perspective.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm not sure I understood well the final part of your question. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Yes. So we hope the dream will come true. Because so this kind of projects, like of virtual reality transfer of the scholarly digital reconstructions into real sites, has now quite a long history, and there are academic groups that are doing this. For example, for Florence, the group that I was mentioning, the Florence 4D project, or Caroline Bruselius have done that for Naples. So we hope we can come to this with Monreale, because there we really have, despite the fact that the materials are so fragmentary, but we have such an enormous amount of information that can be fruitfully crossed, and we have come to verify and define it better, that we really hope that it will be possible. Of course, to do that, it is not enough. The digital model, like the 3D model that I've done in the past that I was showing, because first of all, we need a survey of the building. So we need, of course, for that, we need authorizations, we need the institutional involvement, and we need fundings, because these are projects that require fundings. But the dream is to have the digital model of the actual church, which is absolutely preserved as it was. So the space will be even possible for even suitable for acoustic models, or for any kind of possible also reconstruction in layers, because we have very detailed layers of the different transformations that the space underwent over the centuries. So it will be possible to work on layers and to come back to the original arrangement in 1180, more or less, and really to experience the space big in the space, because the church is preserved as it was. There have been restorations of the mosaics of some parts, but the space is there. So this is the dream for the next future. Thank you for your question.
So, thanks you for an extraordinary presentation, and ask, I'd like to return to the issue of interiors versus exteriors.
Yes.
Liturgical furnishings is obviously connected to the altars and interiors, temporary furnishings, such as wooded platforms, exterior bulkheads, were found outside. You see connections. Is there a possibility of a language used in the interiors that could be found, or that found expressions outside as well?
Very interesting question. Thank you. So One, I think, important distinction is whether we are speaking of movable furnishings, both inside and outside. And of course, in that case, they are mostly lost, they were in wood, and they are more difficult to trace and to detect. If we are speaking of architectural external pulpits, of course, that is crucial for the understanding of how the space worked also inside and outside, and the porosity of the medieval architecture, not only in the time of the liturgy, but also other occasions, for example, public exhibition of relics or political festivities or events and so on. In some cases, this is very clear. Like, for example, I'm thinking of one of the case studies, my personal case studies, I can speak mostly of that, is the church, the Royal Church of Santa Chiara in Naples, where really this connection between the interior and exterior and the creation of corridors to let's say, allow the circulation and this permeability between the spaces was very clear. In terms of materials and of aesthetics, then we come again to the matter of the temporalities, the different temporalities of a church building, and of course depends on the diachronicity or not of what we are considering in that case, specifically speaking of material aspects of these installations. Thank you for the question. Ciao, Ludovico.
Why don't you, there's a question, another question about time-lapse. Are there plans to do that? Which buildings, what are your initial questions, expectations? What would you like to see? By that, and connected to it is a question about story practices.
Mm-hmm.
With a figuring style, they do it. What is the system if you look at this? Because it's a very complex area with development style, and so far we have not arrived at a solution that is accessible for the reader to follow the stories. Which I think is something that affects many other traditions, not specific about events. So time lapses and the journey through the space.
Well, Bisra, that's really an excellent question, and I don't have an answer right now because we have not thought about that yet. But thank you very much for this suggestion about possible developments. This again could be done starting from the beginning. One thing is that of course, we are considering a wide time span and different territories. In some cases, the historiated capitals are not there, as you know, because we have spolia capitals, etc. But for example, for the cloisters, which would be very, very interesting, like Monreale again, or Cava or Benevento. So the journey through these spaces would be really interesting to let's say, to explore. But for the moment we have not thought about that. So thank you very much. I think we can discuss this further, and I'm thankful for suggestions in this sense.
I know this conversation will be continue further, but we're gonna have that coming in very soon.